Hi, my name is Rick Kyte. I'm the director of the D.B. Reinhardt Institute for Ethics and Leadership at Viterbo University, and I'd like to talk to you about ethical decision making. Ethics is important because it's foundational to the way we live our lives, and yet there's a lot of disagreement on just what ethics is. Some people think it's mainly about our values. Some people think it's mostly about the rules that apply to us, whether those are rules of an organization or rules established by professional associations or government agencies. But actually, anytime we talk about what's right or wrong, what's good or bad, how we should live or shouldn't, we're talking about ethics. In 20 years of teaching ethics courses at universities, I've come to the conclusion of many of the ways we commonly teach ethics is actually counterproductive. Think of what you do when you're faced with a very difficult decision and you're not sure what's right or what's wrong. Chances are you go to somebody that you trust. It might be a parent, might be a close friend, a teacher or advisor, but you go to somebody and you talk through the issue. What we want from ethics is an opportunity to make that discussion that we have with others more constructive and more engaging. We don't want our ethical theory to get in the way of how we actually make decisions. And yet that's precisely what many of the approaches do that we teach in high school and college classes, and the approach that's taught from many ethics textbooks. The first thing that happens is a theory is introduced and terminology that's sometimes quite sophisticated and powerful and very important in its place. But terms like utilitarianism and deontology and even virtue ethics, these are terms that don't often come up in our everyday discussion. And so they can have the function of inhibiting dialogue in cases where the person we're talking to hasn't had the same training, hasn't learned the same terminology. Another way in which ethics is often counterproductive in the way that we teach it is that we make a mistaken assumption about the causes of ethical conflict. Conflict doesn't arise just because we don't know enough about ethics. The conflict often arises because we miscommunicate. And so we want an ethical theory that helps us communicate better. Believe it or not, you are an expert in ethical reasoning. Research suggests that it takes 10,000 hours of practice to become really good at something, to become an expert, whether it's basketball or playing a trumpet or golfing. If you spend 10,000 hours doing something, there seems to be a threshold at which you become really good at doing it so that you can do it without really thinking about doing it. But you've been engaging in ethical reasoning since you were about 3 years old, whenever you started learning to speak in sentences. And you can probably remember your parents saying to you things like, "Did you even think about what would happen if you did that?" Or, "How would you feel if Judy stole your Halloween candy and ate it without asking you first?" Parents just start teaching their kids how to engage in ethical thinking at a very early age, and then kids pick it up and mimic it. And as you get older, you get better and better at it. You get more sophisticated, you learn more terminology, and you start doing it so often and so well that you can do it without really thinking about it. You even do it while you're dreaming. It is our very proficiency at ethical reasoning that often causes conflict. Whenever we engage in ethical reasoning, that is, whenever we give any sort of answer to the question, why are you doing this, or why should you do that, we use one of 4 types of ethical thinking. The first one is truth, just trying to figure out what is really going on, what is the case. It could be what is the context of a situation or relevant rules or laws or policy. Whenever we're trying to think about what's happening, what is really going on, we're using the type of thinking I just call truth. The second way of thinking is consequences. This is probably the thinking that Americans are most comfortable with. We tend to be bottom line, practically oriented type of people. So we think about what are the effects of an action. What will happen if I do this? What will happen to others? What will happen to me? We use the words of effects, causes, cost-benefit analysis, the pros and cons of a situation. Third way of thinking about ethics is fairness. Whenever we use terms like rights or equality, respect, autonomy, we're using a broad category called fairness. And what's really basic to fairness is the idea of the golden rule. Treat others the way you would want to be treated. This is an assertion of a basic kind of equality. If I expect to be treated the way that I could imagine that others would want to be treated as well, and if I imagine that I should treat others the way that I would want to be treated, I'm asserting a basic kind of equality between us. And this is, again, a type of thinking that we learn from a very early age. The fourth kind of thinking is character. Character is when we think more about the people's behavior, motivation, the quality of people's relationships. We think about the person first rather than the action. So when we say that somebody is being generous or kind or cruel or mean-spirited or courageous or cowardly, what we're talking about there is character. And so this is, again, a distinct type of thinking than the other four. Because we're so good at using these four ways of thinking, and we've been using them ever since we were children, it's pretty easy for us to use them without even knowing that we're doing it. We do this as naturally as breathing. We just generate moral reasons. The problem with this is that we can generate types of reasons without realizing that we're doing it, and we might be using reasons that don't really coincide with the way somebody else is using reasons. For example, if I'm talking about something that I want to do using consequences, and somebody else objects to it using reasons that refer to fairness, we're not really engaging in a conversation that can be constructive because there's no way to resolve it. All we know is that we're in disagreement. And so what we have to do is figure out how do we use the same kind of reasoning at the same time. Let me give you an example of how this can create a conflict. Several years ago, a company named Matthew Construction, a major road construction company based in La Crosse, Wisconsin, purchased a new property where they wanted to build an expanded plant, a renovated asphalt production plant. The property was located in Bryce Prairie, right near Lake Onalaska in Wisconsin. Now the location of this was right across a road where there are many lakefront homes. And you can imagine when people who lived on these lakefront homes, they found out that a company was going to build an asphalt production plant right across the street from them. They were pretty upset. Of course, the people who worked for Matthew Construction, they wanted this proposal to go forward because it was located pretty close to where the old plant was located. They would not have to relocate their families in order to keep their jobs. And so here you had a classic confrontation between two groups of people with very different interests. And as I read letters to the editor in the La Crosse Tribune over the next year, there were letters on this topic just about every day for over a year, about 18 months. I cut out these letters and I wanted to see what were the types of things that people were saying pro and con on this issue. And it was very interesting. About 90% of the letters that were opposed to the asphalt plant referenced consequences. They were from homeowners or people that knew the homeowners, and they would say things like, we're concerned that the asphalt plant is going to lead to a reduction in air quality. We're concerned about runoff into Lake Onalaska. It was going to increase traffic, and that might pose a safety hazard for our children. What about property values, and what happens to the citizens if they lose their tax base because of lower property values along that stretch of road? Well, you can see that all of these kinds of reasons reference consequences. And they don't reference consequences just because the people that live along there happen to always think in terms of consequences. They reference consequences because that's what works best to further the argument opposing the plant. The people that were in favor of having the plant locate there used a very different kind of argument. Their letters said things like this: you can't change the rules in the middle of the game. This property was zoned for industrial use. If the residents that lived in Bryce Prairie wanted that to be, wanted to rule out any kind of industrial use, they could have changed the zoning, and they had 30 years to do that. It's not fair to change the rules just because you don't like how it applies to you. The other sort of thing that came up fairly often was what a great company Matthew was to work for, how much they contributed to the community, and how much employers liked working for them. Well, that first kind of reason referred to fairness. It talked about the process, that if we have common rules that apply to everyone equally, and we have to respect that. And that second kind of reasoning referred to character. Well, you can imagine what goes on as these letters to the editor continue over the course of a year. The tone gets more and more strident. It gets angrier because the people arguing against the proposal are using one kind of reasoning. The people arguing for the proposal are using a different kind. And what they recognize is that there's another group of people opposed to them that don't seem to be paying attention to the kind of reasoning that they're using. And each side seems to be making the assumption that the opposing side either is not very ethical because they don't care about the issue, or they're just not bright enough to understand the very good reasons that they are putting forth. And so you have a classic misunderstanding of two groups of people, both using ethical reasoning, but not understanding that they're only using one type, and that the other side is using another type. You see, it's very difficult for any group or any community, once they've taken a position on something, to then stop back and really re-examine their reasons. And so this is how the very sophistication that we have, our very proficiency with ethical reasoning, can actually create conflict by allowing us to generate reasons without knowing that we're generating just one type and really not listening to the others. A very useful tool for engaging in ethical reasoning is something I call the four-way method. So how do we take this ethical reasoning, which sometimes can actually create ethical conflict, and turn it into productive conversation? This is something that I talk about at greater length in my book, An Ethical Life. And there I introduce something called the four-way method for ethical decision-making. This is just a model to remind us of how to engage our reflective mind rather than just using our intuitive, our kind of natural way of ethical thinking, which sometimes creates conflict. First of all, the reflective brain is a matter of stepping back. Whenever we step back, we get a look at a bigger picture. What we're doing is we're widening our perspective on things. But we need something to help remind us how to do this. So this four-way method, which suggests that we start with truth, we move on to consequences, then we proceed to fairness, and then we go on to character, gives us a way of stepping back and not just using one of those ways of thinking or two of them, but using them all so that we take advantage of all the things that we've learned and all the ways that other people that we're talking to may be thinking about something. Now this sounds pretty easy to do, but it's actually incredibly difficult. And let me share a story with you. A few years ago, this was after I'd been teaching ethics all day long. I'd probably been using this very four-way method in my classes. I go home about 5 in the evening, and my wife and my son, who's 14 years old at the time, are engaged in an argument. It's a Thursday night. He wants to have a sleepover. And he's saying the usual things that kids at that age say, that all the other kids' parents have said that they can do the sleepover. Why don't we treat him like the other kids are treated? He'll never raise his kids the way we're raising him. We should respect him. He's old enough to make decisions for himself. My wife, in the meantime, she's making arguments like, well, you won't get enough sleep. You've got a biology test in the morning. You kids will probably stay up and talk half the night. She's talking about consequences. What are all the bad things that will happen as a result of doing this? She's saying you can have the sleepover on the weekend, but there are just too many bad consequences on a weeknight. He, on the other hand, is referring to fairness. He's saying treat me like others, have respect for my autonomy. I'm old enough to make decisions for myself. And this is kind of classic disagreements between parents and children, the one thinking about what are the bad things that could happen, the other one thinking about I want to assert my own autonomy, my own independence. Well, I walk into the room and there's already an argument going on, so it's an emotional setting. And usually when we have an ethical disagreement with others, it's an emotional issue. It's people's interests are at stake. They've got something that they care about. The emotions come into play, and when that happens, our reflective mind is not engaged. What happens is our intuitive mind comes to work, and we immediately take a position. And so even though I've been teaching an ethics class, we were talking about how do we step back and think through these things. As soon as I walk into that room, I just immediately take the position of a parent. And I start repeating all the things my wife had just said for the last 15 or 20 minutes. You can't do a sleepover on a Thursday night. You have a test in the morning. You won't get enough sleep. You'll be crabby all day. All the same things. Which means that my son now has two people that aren't listening to his reasons, but are just asserting something that, to his mind, appears really irrelevant. And two parents then who are thinking, here's a son who isn't listening to a thing we're saying. And we get mutually frustrated. He storms upstairs to his room. Now what I should have done is just step back and say, what kind of reasoning are both of us using? And how can we step back and all use the same kind of thinking at the same time? And probably the most important thing to do is to start with truth. Just ask a very basic question like, well, is it really true that the other parents all agreed that their kids could have the sleepover? Actually, I found out the next day that my wife talked to some of the other parents and found out they'd all had the same argument at their house. Nobody had bothered to actually find out what was really the consequences. And this is really typical. So we need a model for decision making, not because it's really complex or that we really can't remember it, but in emotional situations where ethical issues most often occur, our intuitive mind just jumps right into the fight. And we need something external to us to remind us, no, we need to step back, we need to look at this method of reasoning, this mode of reasoning, this one, and this one, and this one. And that's what the four-way method helps us to do. There are three ways to use the four-way method for ethical decision making. The first way one can use the four-way method for ethical reasoning is for personal reflection. If I want to make sure I've really thoroughly considered something, that I'm not just jumping to a conclusion using one way of reasoning without considering the others, what I can do is step back, use my reflective mind to say, have I considered the truth? Have I considered consequences? Have I considered fairness? Have I considered character? And just step through and ask the questions that are on this guide to thinking. I'll make sure that I do not unintentionally have blind spots in the way I'm thinking something. It'll help me be more thorough and more consistent. The second way you can use this four-way method is for facilitating a group discussion. Lots of times if we're serving on a committee or we have a group in our business or an organization and we have to come to some kind of consensus about what to do, we need to make sure that the dominant person in the room doesn't set forth one way of reasoning and keep others from really participating in the discussion or having their full input, or having the ways of reasoning that they're using be expressed. The other thing we want to do is make sure that everybody uses the same way of thinking at the same time so that people aren't actually talking past one another. So if you're a facilitator in a discussion like that, what you want to do is say, well, let's talk about truth first. Make sure that everybody is on the same page, that we all have the same understanding of what's really going on, what the context is. Then move on to consequences. What are our options in this situation? Who's affected by all those options? How are they affected? And are those effects good or bad? Then on to fairness. Is everybody being treated equally in this situation? Are people being treated with respect? If we were in that position, how would we want to be treated? And then finally, character. We can look at people's motivations. We can say, are these solutions that we're considering, are they motivated by trust and goodwill? Are they something that can be done with wisdom or with patience or charity? Whatever the particular virtues that we're interested in are. The final way that we might use the four-way method is simply for communicating say a tendentious or controversial decision. If we're in a business or an organization that has to announce something, but it's a decision that can't involve everybody in the decision, but it affects others, we want to make sure in our very communication of our decision that we show that we've considered all four ways of thinking. Otherwise, we're very likely to be criticized based on the way of thinking that we did not communicate. Let me share one final example of a way in which somebody used the four-way method in their organization. A few months ago, I had a conversation with somebody who had recently taken a class with me where we talked about the four-way method. He's a supervisor at a manufacturing plant, and he told me about an incident he had where he had to use this method to help resolve a potential conflict at work. He'd received an email while at work one evening from the physical plant supervisor at the plant where he works. He said a light had fallen from the ceiling of this plant. And the ceiling of the plant is about 2 stories high. So this large fluorescent light fixture had fallen to the floor, narrowly missing somebody who was working at one of the workstations there. The engineering supervisor, who we'll call Mark, what he said is, in response to the email, he said, let's talk about this first thing in the morning and see what we need to do. He comes in the morning and the maintenance guy says, well, they've taken care of the problem. He says they found out the cause of the light fixture falling was some rusted bolts that had corroded from a small leak in the roof. The roof had been repaired a few years earlier. It just took a while for the corrosion to complete the process, and that's why the light fell. He said they inspected the lights all around that one. They were all fine, so it was an isolated incident, no problem. Mark was thinking about this, and he counted the number of lights in the ceiling, about 200 lights, and he thought, we haven't tested most of these lights. What if there's another one that's bad? But he knew that if he just went right to the head of maintenance and said, we need to inspect all these lights, it might create a rift in their relationship. It means he's questioning the judgment of a fellow employee. And he's also wondering, do the lights really get inspected the way they should if it's something I make him do and he doesn't believe they need to be done? So instead of just telling the head of maintenance what he thinks they should do, he says, let's make sure that we've really thought through this thoroughly. And so he pulls out his copy of the four-way method for decision making, and he says, let's just talk through these 4 ways of thinking. And they do. They start with truth. They just ask the questions, what's going on, make sure they have the same understanding of the facts. And then the consequences. What are our various options? We could inspect them all, but that costs a lot of time and money to have to put scaffolding up under these lights and then disassemble it again and reconstruct it in other places in the plant. It's going to take a lot of work, a lot of time, and probably a lot of money. On the other hand, what if they find something? They would perhaps save a life if they find something that needs to be fixed. Then they look at fairness. How would I feel if I were one of the workers that was stationed under a light that had not been inspected? Would I want that one inspected or not? Then they look at character. Well, what's motivating our decision? Are we doing this because we are too rushed or we're impatient? Are we doing it because we're really being thorough and we're people of integrity? What is motivating one decision versus the other? They go through the whole thing without Mark ever saying, this is what I think we should do. And at the end of it, the maintenance supervisor said, we really need to inspect all those lights. So he does. Over the course of the next week, they inspect all 200 lights. and they find 7 others with rusted bolts. Now what happens in a case like this is the maintenance supervisor can come back to Mark and say, look, we made the right decision. We decided this together. We maybe saved somebody's life. And that's a very different situation than if he were on the defensive and saying, well, I guess you told me so. And this indicates something really important about ethical decision making. It's not just about making the right decision. It's also making decisions the right way. And if we go back to what we said at the very beginning of this video, why is ethics important? Well, it's important because it's a guide to how we live our life. It's important for maintaining relationships with others. Not just that we do the right thing, but that we live with others in a way that helps us to figure out what is the common good, to deepen our relationships, to be happier, more successful people, to have a fuller, richer, more well-rounded life. And so it's very important that when we make decisions, we not just make decisions that allow us to be self-justified. They're decisions that allow us to really engage others more fully in a shared vision of how we ought to live.